Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Banos Talk. My name is Justin Collins. On tonight's episode, I'm going to be talking about a reoccurring theme that I'm seeing within our city government and something that I'm seeing coming up at the meetings consistently, and that is a serious lack of planning. Now, overall, this video is admittedly more or less an opinion piece. However, I'm going to be showing you footage from the actual council meetings to back up and prove what I'm saying. A statement such as there is a lack of planning is by definition an opinion statement, but I'm going to show you many tangible, concrete examples where openly our city government admits that there actually is no plan. In some cases, there's recently a plan, but there hasn't been one up until just now. I think you, as the citizens of Los Banos, have a right to know about these things. And so I'm going to show you what I've been researching and what I've been looking at. And I hope you enjoy it and find it informative and useful. And I'll be getting into all of that in just a moment, right after a brief message from our sponsor.
So here we have the Kabirya, and it has Mirya. Onion, cabbage, cilantro.
And then there's some lime. And we're back. Thanks for watching. So a lot of you are probably already aware, have the general sentiment that a lot of things in our city is kind of done by the hip. Well, I had heard this before, but I wasn't really entirely convinced until I had seen more and more meetings come up and where staff had consistently admitted to the fact that there actually is no plan for a lot of the things. So unfortunately, it seems that kind of the policy we have to an extent on many areas, whether it go from housing development, naming of streets, economic development, where trees go, parks, all kinds of things, even where roads go, largely it just seems to be wishful thinking and hoping that these things just magically come to fruition on their own in the way that we would like, without actually making any rules, guidance, regulations, or plans to actually make them do as we would like. Now, some of this has started to change. For instance, when I talked about trees just now, we've never had an official tree plan in our city, ever, until this last year. And that's largely to do with the work of staff and Parks and Recs Director Joe Hine. But it's crazy to think that for this longest time, people have complained about the fact that we don't really have enough trees and we don't have enough shade. And yet we've never actually made any kind of tangible plan up until now to actually address said issue. Now, Benjamin Franklin once said, failing to plan is planning to fail. And I couldn't agree more, especially in this particular case. For the longest time under Mayor Mike Vialta, for instance, the Economic Development Advisory Commission didn't even meet. There weren't even meetings. In fact, when I started on the commission, we had to open up by basically approving of the minutes to which nobody standing there was even at said prior meeting, and it was from over a year ago. The reality is that in many areas we've had this wait and see approach, just see what happens. And there is some serious problems with that. And it's not just the lack of planning and then things don't come out the way you want. That's part of it. The other part of the problem is the fact that when you don't have any kind of policy in place, what ends up happening is that it's become something that staff just deals with. And I'm not saying that there's a problem with our staff, but what I am saying is that this is very undemocratic. What this essentially means is that our elected officials go into office, and then go to sleep. And then they allow staff to handle so many things to the point that basically they don't handle anything or much of anything for that matter. Now, I want to be clear. Lately, the council has kind of gone in a weird direction, which I didn't really anticipate. As I've complained about the fact that they were overly reliant on staff. And I mean, they honestly really were. And I'm going to show you some examples of that in our past history and our past precedents of how reliant we've really become. They've kind of taken a turn from governing to micromanagement, and that's not really what was intended or what anyone wants. They don't need to oversee and make every single decision firsthand. But what they do need to do is come up with governing, guiding policies that give staff direction as to what they want, and then turn staff loose and let them do their thing. After all, it is their job. But the problem is that we don't have any of these governing policies. And then some things have just been cultural precedent. And this gives staff tremendous power. And again, like I said, the problem isn't that staff is bad. I'm not making that case. But what I am saying is that it's incredibly undemocratic to have staff make such monumentous decisions without any input really from the council whatsoever. And so to illustrate my point, I'm going to show you some clips from a recent budget workshop that our city council actually held back in April. And basically the city council, largely being a new council, is kind of really confused as to how come this budget report doesn't actually show any expenses. How come it doesn't actually show any numbers of what things cost? And this is actually the answer that our city finance director gives him.
The shovels more around.
Yeah, and I actually do have a department detailed list with the numbers, and I apologize, and I didn't share it with Gary, and I should have, but previous administration suggested that I not include it. So I did not, and I didn't share it with Gary to get his perspective on the situation, and I should have. So I do apologize for that. But
now she laughs, and I think rightfully so, because it doesn't make sense to present to council a budget workshop without numbers in it, right? Unless you didn't want the citizenry to know what things cost in order to make it easier for things to get passed, in order for you to conceal how much and where you're spending money on. So that way you can hide them under larger umbrella projects and people can't see itemized what things are cost. Now, when she's talking about previous councils, they can't really be political because they're staff, right? So they're not really supposed to kind of play the blame game. But I can say what she's talking about. She's talking about under like Mike Vialta, right, under Mayor Mike, who'd been the mayor for the last several years, and other councils. But admittedly, Tom Faria and Deborah Lewis were both also on that council as well, and Brett Jones too, but Brett Jones has only been in for one term. But yes, previous administrations have requested that staff not include numbers in the budget report that goes before the council. Tom Faria, in a more diplomatic and polite way, basically says that he wishes that staff would put numbers in the budget so that way they can actually think about it and kind of digest it in time for the next workshop or meeting. Deborah Lewis, however, is a lot more candid with her response. Let's take a listen.
Mayor Pro Tem Lewis?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to stick my foot in my mouth just a bit here. First of all, I agree with the mayor that we need to have more information on this with the amounts in regards to each priority category. And the foot and mouth that I want to say is that, you know, today's a new day. We have a new city manager, and what was said to staff in the past no longer applies. I myself expect to have as much information to make a logical decision based on what's in front of us. So I just want to say that up front, that you know, we're moving forward for something good in our city, and that's a part of it.
And essentially, if you look at the PowerPoint, basically what you see is that each item just lists the item like what it is. So, for instance, the surveillance cameras, right, that the police were asking for. It mentions what the item is, but it doesn't say what it would cost and what it would be funded from. Now, because of this meeting and because of the council's remarks and complaints, they ended up holding additional meetings. The following meeting the next week included numbers, included extra costs. Then they had an additional meeting which went even more thoroughly and showed where things were funded from. Then they had the final meeting, which was this last month, and where they actually voted on it. But needless to say, I don't want to make you think that they voted on a budget without numbers on it. That would not be true. They, in fact, did force basically staff to give them the information. What I want you to see is the fact that up until literally now, the norm had been to not openly basically share what the budget was, what things were spent on in the meetings. Council wasn't really privy, unless they asked for, I guess, the information, and then were expected to vote on it. Now, you might think to yourself, it's rather gutsy of Sonia Williams to put forth a budget without numbers and ask them to accept it. But it's actually not, because that has actually been the norm in our city for quite some time, and actually was the previous direction. And I'm not really surprised that she's kind of thrown back by the fact that council rebuked it so quickly, because here's the reality of it. Tom Faria, while he is a new mayor, he's been on council for years. Deborah Lewis has also been on council for years. So there's a part of me that kind of says to myself, okay, you seem to be really upset about the way staff is doing it, but staff had been doing it this way under the entirety of your political career. And it's only now that you're concerned about it, and only now that you want this kind of transparency. It's one thing to say we're sorry and we've changed our mind of how we're going to do things, but it's an entirely different thing to point at staff and say, shame on you for something that you used to ask them to do. And now you've suddenly changed your mind and I guess expected them to just know. So while I'm happy that the council has changed in this direction, at the same time, I think it's absurd to sit here and just let them off the hook on something they've been doing for years and years and years, and suddenly now change. What changed? I personally think they've changed their act because of increased political coverage, because they know now thousands of people watch the council meetings via the show. I think prior to this, they didn't care less, and now they don't really have a choice because of media like this. But that's just my opinion. Other such plans which came up in part of the budget meetings, and I'm not going to go show clips from all of it, but to basically paraphrase, Kenneth Lambert and Refugio Llamas had asked, hey, how come we don't seem to have any kind of policy for replacing our vehicles? And the reality is that we don't. We don't have a maintenance schedule. We don't have any kind of regular methodology, and where we know based on a schedule, like every so few years, we're going to rotate a vehicle out or put a new one in, or everything is going to have an oil change on these scheduled times, or this maintenance on these times, or scheduled setup, blah, blah, blah. We don't have that. And basically right now what we do is we buy a vehicle as we need it. Every time we think we need it, it becomes a political debate. Then we buy a vehicle or we don't. We then have that vehicle. We don't plan to maintain it. We don't really plan to regularly check on it. We don't plan maintenance, anything like that. And then basically when it just breaks down and the wheels are falling off, we argue over whether we really need to replace it again or not. That honestly sums up actually how we basically do business. And they kind of admitted that directly in the meetings, really, to which Mayor Faria had said, why don't we create some kind of regular fleet maintenance schedule and where we can just kind of service vehicles on a regular basis, planned out, increase their longevity, and buy new vehicles as would be needed based on the average and typical life expectancy of vehicle. Frankly, that's great. I would say that that makes a lot of sense. And that's something that virtually every city out there does. And so I'm kind of mind blown that our city doesn't do anything like that. In terms of maintenance, when we look at our police headquarters, we're now just building an entirely new police headquarters. And many of you know this. But did you ever wonder why we never, ever really fixed up the old one? It was actually explained to me because I had asked about it. Basically, the problem is that the state increases regulations on how the building needs to be fixed. The moment you try to fix one thing or touch one thing, now you have to bring it up to code. We kept putting off maintenance for so long that it got to a tipping point in where bringing it up to code would cost almost as much as to make a new building. So because we basically didn't do our maintenance year by year or every 5 years or something more reasonable, and basically let that building sit for like 50 years without touching it, we got to a point where it was unsafe, not really fit at all for the facility it's intended to be. But now we can't afford to do any repairs on it because of our horrible planning. And then it gets to a point where we just have to build a new one because then actually that makes the most sense. Also, let's talk about a master plan, right? Just for our city in general, how it's planned out. So it's largely looks like our border, kind of like, as I describe it, a jigsaw puzzle or Frankenstein monster. And that's largely because honestly, the developers really dictate how our city is shaped, built, where, when, and what. The reality is that the way it's gone up till now, and this was admitted in the last city council meeting, is that basically developers develop said land, put the roads where they put it, et cetera, et cetera. And then the city agrees to adopt it, but really after it's already been done, and once it's really too late, and at that point they have no choice. The street names are come up with by the developers, the street locations, virtually everything, pretty much just done by the developers. Whatever trees they're going to put in, there's really no or was no guidance. There was no direction of how they were supposed to do and what. We're just relying completely, really, on the benevolence of the developers to do it the way we would, I guess, hope, but without putting any front loading or guidance proactively into the plan. And so, once again, here's Deborah Lewis going on a rant about this and complaining about how she feels as though developers basically have the most say in designing of the city.
Any of the three options that have been put forward to us, what I would like to see, and this would mean that there's going to be some upgrading into how we do our communities. And what I want to see for Los Banos is I want to see us start the process where we have planned communities and we have master plans. And in those master plans, depending on what the theme of that community is going to be, will determine what the street names are going to be. But what I'm trying to propose here is looking to the future for Los Banos, that we as a council try to help set up a process where we have master plans for our communities and not just randomly have developers decide how our community is going to be developed, that comes from within the city. So I would like to see the street naming policy be a part of the master planning that I feel that we should start developing for the city of Los Banos. And for me, it doesn't matter if it's, a 5-10 acre development. It needs to be master planned. And what we've done in years past is just allow the developer to come with a master plan, and we have to kind of like figure our way through it, whether it's good or not or whatever. And by the time it gets to council, there are things within that plan that we may or may not approve of. So I'd like to see us start in a different direction about how we do development in this city. And with that process, the street naming can go inside of that. So that's my take on it, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
So that's what Councilwoman Lewis said. But keep in mind again, if you recall, this was a long time ago, back when I really kind of first started doing this. But I actually had Greg Hostetler on the show, and he owns Stonefield Homes, as many of you guys know. And to make a long story short, he actually advocated for Master Plan 2 because he basically said, look, I just kind of want to know what's happening. I don't really like this shooting by the hip, rules changing every day, not really knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. And one of the things he talked about was, he said, they could plan out streets better and lay larger pipe for sewage purposes if they knew really how big the city was ultimately going to get. And what we kind of do now with developers is, because it's so politically unpopular to annex land and accept it, even though we have no choice. So a lot of times, candidates like Tom Freya, for instance, he promised that he would never annex the land again. But I'm here to tell you now that we're about to annex some more land really soon. And we really don't have much of a choice. That was a promise he couldn't keep, and he knows he can't keep. What he's done in the past is, whenever he wants to seem like he's going to vote no on it, he just doesn't go to that meeting. And that's probably what he's honestly going to do again this meeting if history is going to repeat itself. But needless to say, land's going to get annexed again for developers very soon. There's really nothing the city can do about it. Politicians are going to run on it. They're going to pretend to oppose it, even though the reality is they can't anyway. It'll happen. And then because of this anti-development vitriol, what'll happen is that we will lose all chance to basically actually plan it, because we won't cooperate with them whatsoever. So then they'll still get the development that they want. And on top of that, they'll call all the shots. So this not making a master plan for the sake of pretending like we're halting development when we know we really can't, is honestly lying and disingenuous to you, because they don't just honestly tell you, hey, we can't stop the developers. That's what they should tell you. But instead, they lie and make promises like, we'll never annex land again, which is a load of BS. That's not true. They can't do that. It's going to happen. They have no choice. The state literally mandates growth and housing building because we're in a housing shortage. So there's no choice not to. But by taking this extreme anti-stance for showboating purposes, what happens is that we just basically get cut out of the process and have no say. So if you know what's going to happen, whether you like it or not, wouldn't you at least like to plan it or have some say about it? I mean, that's at least my thinking, but that's also what they're now starting to think. Now, granted, again, I sat here and I listened to Miss Lewis basically talk about how in years past, as if it was separate from her, but really she's been on the council for quite some time. And I'm just kind of surprised that how come these people who've been on the council for a long time, who've been doing this and implementing these policies, are now suddenly very against the very policies they used to uphold. I find that kind of interesting and weird, but hey, I guess it's still going in a positive direction. And unfortunately, one of the things that's happening is now some of the city councils kind of drifting away from the idea of governing and going really to the micromanaging. And that's not what anybody means by council being more authoritative or actually governing. In my opinion, what council should do is start creating these plans and these policies that tell staff in advance what to do. When it came to the street naming, the reason why we're having this discussion is because we have no street naming policy. And so they had to admit there is no policy. What usually happens is the developer comes up with a street name and really just checks and sees if it doesn't duplicate with another street name already in the city, and if it's easy to phonetically pronounce. And that's about it. The city council has more or less had it in its purview to review this at any given time. However, now the city council is kind of talking about wanting to review each and every name individually and have a direct say in that process. But that's kind of getting complicated and convoluted and a little micromanagey. There were some more simplistic options put before, like assemble a commission of local citizens who can pick the names, or just give them a theme and then let them pick within that. Like, for example, you could say World War II is the theme, and then you could have Iwo Jima Road, and Normandy Drive, and so on, right? So there's different concepts and ideas out there and ways to do this, but what we're in right now is we're in a period of things used to be done basically pretty much by staff alone, kind of backroom dealing. And then when it got to city council, it was already decided. Nobody really asked questions. Nobody really could ask questions. No information was presented in the meeting, and everything was decided before it already got there. Now there's more of a demand from the citizenry for transparency, and people are calling them out on it. I would say I'm a big part of that. That being said, now they're having to do things the correct way, and it's kind of interesting seeing them figure out and find that way, and how constantly it keeps coming up, the fact that we don't have plans, we don't have policies. We really just kind of shoot by the hip on about everything. Virtually nothing in the city is really all that planned. Everything is kind of spontaneous and by the moment. And we're really just kind of playing city council as we go. And the reality is that we kind of have to. We owe it to our children. We owe it to posterity. We can't simply just keep doing things by the hip, looking at only in the moment and not thinking about the future anymore. Our city is getting too big and growing too fast to just be run by at the hip, and decisions being made without further than maybe 2 to 4 years down the line. We just can't keep doing that anymore. Looking at our city for 5 minutes is a great example of what happens when you don't plan. We have an airport in probably the most horrible location that limits where we could put a hospital and any building over 3 stories. We have parts of our downtown don't even have running water or high-speed internet yet. Granted, that's getting fixed. But my point is holy cow, we're in the 21st century and we're just now starting to plan some of this stuff. It makes no sense. So I'm glad we're starting the process now, but it's embarrassing that we haven't even considered this stuff until now. And frankly, I'd rather hear, our council members like Tom Faria and Deborah Lewis, instead of pounding their fists and being angry that none of these plans have ever come to fruition, instead apologize for the fact that they never made these plans come to fruition, since they've been on council for 10 years plus. And they were a large part of creating this no planning, no asking questions culture that we're now fighting and dealing with. So that's my opinion. But what's yours? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Hopefully you found this information useful and helpful, and maybe it'll spur a great conversation about our city and the need for a better master plan, and the need for policies and guidelines that are set into law that make sense and that would direct staff where to go, so that way there's no longer this large power vacuum and where staff has a lot of control simply because there's really no policy otherwise, and they kind of have no choice but to just decide on their own. If you haven't already, please follow, subscribe to Los Banos Talk. We have Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and of course, losbanostalk.com. You can become a supporter of Los Banos Talk for just $4.99 a month. Gain access to all the videos first and ad-free, plus gain bonus behind-the-scenes exclusive content and opinion pieces as well. Once again, my name is Justin Collins, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.